All right, I'm sitting here in my great-grandparents' attic, and if you just drove down the street, you might think that this is just any old neighborhood with any old houses in right in the heart of Oak Cliff in Dallas, Texas. But to me, this house is so much more than that. To me, this house was one of the only constant things in my childhood. It wasn't, during my childhood, it wasn't my great grandparents' house, it was my grandmother's house. My grandmother, Virginia, moved into this house in 1999, which is the year that I was born. And so throughout my whole childhood, this was grandma's house. This was the constant. This was, every child loves that feeling of going to grandma's house, spending time with grandma, or when grandma comes and picks you up and you get that one day with grandma or that afternoon or that ice cream date or whatever. It was the peak of childhood, was getting to spend time in this house and getting to spend time with my grandma. Fast forward to 2018, I was actually able to move into this house when I was moving back from Central America, because I had lived in there in Panama for several years. And so I was on my way back into the US, and I was stepping out of my parents' house and stepping into adulthood in the safety of grandma's house. In Dallas, in the same city as my grandma until I was 5. But when I was 5, we moved down because my father took a missions pastor's job in South Texas, south of San Antonio, on the border in this town called Laredo. And so visits to grandma's house came very seldom because she was so far away. She would come down and visit us but she was a businesswoman. She was constantly running to different offices that she had around the country, and she was just very, very busy. So for us to come and visit her at her house was hard, but for her to come and visit us was easy. So she would come to visit us a couple times a year. And so those trips to grandma's house became even more precious and even more prized. And I just distinctly remember being 11 years old. It was the first time that I ever got to fly on an airplane. My dad took me from Laredo and we flew to Dallas with him, and I got to stay at grandma's house, and I was the only grandkid. She had 13 grandkids. So to be the only grandkid in your grandma's presence was just the most surreal thing. You had 100% undivided attention. You got to do all the arts and crafts that you could imagine. You got to pick all the snacks, and grandma went crazy with the sugar and stuff. And so it was everything a child could ever hope for. And so some of my best childhood memories were made right here in this house before I ever had any sort of radar for what the rest of the world was going to be like. So during my childhood, we didn't have a lot of constants because my parents moved from Dallas to Laredo to be missions pastors. And then eventually, after being missions pastors for a little while, they felt the call to return to the mission field, which they were doing before I was born, in Central America. And so the mission field, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is just anywhere where you're doing the work of the Lord. And so you can be a missionary in your local city, but you could also be a missionary, foreignly. So throughout my childhood, my parents were constantly pursuing to be used by God where God wanted them to be. And so sometimes that meant doing things that didn't necessarily make sense. And so at one point, before I was born, they sold everything that they had and they moved to Nicaragua. And they were living amongst the people, working alongside of Doctors Without Borders and Red Cross and Mercy Ships and YWAM, all these nonprofit, philanthropic organizations that are centered towards the betterment of humanity. And so that was the household that I was born into, was people who were dedicated to seeing the advancement of humans, regardless of socioeconomic background, regardless of religion or belief or policies or anything. It was just helping people for the sake of people getting helped, And so when I was 5, we had been living in Dallas. My dad had got his master's in theology, learning how to read and write in Greek and Hebrew and study the original text and just be very involved in the logical side of everything, and so that he could equip other pastors so that they could then pastor their congregations and equip their congregations to pastor each other, and kind of, have this thing where it's like we learn how to take care of each other so that we can take care of ourselves, so that we can take care of each other, kind of thing. So after my dad got his master's in theology and he was looking to rejoin the mission field, it was just a really transitional season because my brother had just been diagnosed with diabetes, and It just seemed like all the doctors were advising that they do not leave the country because healthcare outside of the country wasn't quite to where we were, and it was everything. My parents, not knowing what they didn't know, they felt inspired to stay and to get a pastoring job. So that's why we ended up in Laredo. And man, I just remember the move down to Laredo was, my parents had already had 7 kids at this point. My little brother was 6 months old, and it's a 8-hour drive down from Dallas to Laredo, Texas. And so, I mean, I just remember loading up the U-Haul, loading up the little minivan and taking the other car, and just this long drive. It seemed like it took a lifetime to get down there. So of course now we make that drive and it's not nearly as bad. However, when you're a kid, time seems to stand still when you're stuck in the car. And so, yeah, I just remember like when we first got there to Laredo, the first time that Grandma came down to visit us, it seemed like it had been so long since we'd seen her. Of course, I'm sure it had only been 10 days. And she was coming down to make sure that we were settled in our new place and everything was set. And of course, she comes just like she always did, with bearing gifts, ready to spend quality time with each of her kids and each of her grandkids individually. And just to, even if it was only 20 minutes or an hour, her love language was quality time. So she always wanted to just get one-on-one time with you. And so she would take you for a drive and you'd go around and you'd go to Sonic, and then you'd come back inside with your ice cream, and then she'd pick up her other grandkid and you'd go do the same thing and go around and grab Sonic and whatever. She was just very intentional about making sure that you had quality one-on-one time with her, which I always admired. And so then I just remember constantly being in a state of wondering, when am I going to be able to go back to visit Grandma? When am I going to be able to go back to Grandma's house? When am I going to be able to get to spend time with her? And of course, as things go, and busy families, and we continue to, our family continued to grow in Laredo. My parents, at that point, they had adopted my last 2 siblings, so there were 7 biological kids, and then the last 2 were adopted, and my grandma was able to come down and spend some time helping babysit while my parents were actually in Ethiopia. This house has been in my family for so long, and of course there's always been different plans about what was going to happen with the house. My great-grandparents left the house to my grandma and her siblings, and her 2 brothers didn't want anything to do with the house really, so they just gave it to my grandmother. And then her plan, of course, was to give it to her son, my Uncle Derek, but unfortunately he had MS or Lyme disease or a couple of different really horrible illnesses that over the course of 10 years slowly took his life. And it was a long, terrible process, watching his wife and his kids have to go through just this whole stage of life. And then he passed in 2017. And so they were planning on moving in a few years after that. And he was going to be the one who redid the whole house, build it up from the foundation, and new patios and roof and insulation in the attic and all of that stuff, And he just wasn't able to complete that before his time came to him. And so I was just turning 18 when my uncle passed away. And I just remember that phone call. It was the day after I graduated from my discipleship training school that I was doing, my Bible school. And my goal was to continue on in missions and to continue to serve. However, at this season of my life with my uncle passing, and everything kind of shifted in my family and with my grandma, and her mental health went down exponentially because she had been holding on to the fact that her son was going to be moving into the house with her to walk with her in the final stages of her life, and then that didn't happen. So I didn't initially move in with the intentions of staying here until she passed. It was out of a season of, well, I'm 18, I want to start my own life and forge my own path kind of thing. But I also want to do it in the safety of Grandma's house. And all of my other siblings did that also. This house has been historical in my family just for that reason, because all my older siblings and even my younger sister, in between living with mom and dad and living on your own in adulthood, we all had a transitional season where we lived in grandma's house. So the different rooms in this house have housed all of my older siblings and my younger sibling. And so this house has been very influential for all of us. And so, yeah, so I moved in for that season of that transitional moment of life, and I started working. And I realized how my grandma, who had always been the most joyous woman, taking us to prayer meetings and spending time with her church and doing ministry opportunities, she had been a Sunday school teacher at church for the entirety of the time that she had grandkids. Maybe even before that, I'm not positive what sparked her getting into the Sunday school teaching at church, but she'd been doing it well before I was alive, and she continued to do it well after all of her grandkids grew out of that age. She was just a servant-hearted woman. And yeah, so with me moving in and seeing her in that season of her life and just being very depressed, feeling like she doesn't really have a lot of hope, and she's still plugged into communities and stuff, but she's lost her son. You know, it's a life-changing moment. So building off of what my grandmother accomplished and what she did spiritually and what she did relationally in her family unit, is you have my mom, who took everything that she learned, and she learned some from my grandma and she learned some from church, and she didn't really learn the depth of what she knows until her and my dad had been married, until they had already had kids together. And then that's when they would say that they were born again. But my mom was able to build off of my grandma's foundation and the things that my grandma did for her. And so we have, as a band with my bandmate Paige, we have this song where it says, "Our children's floor was our ceiling." And we think about, you know, everything that a parent can achieve, you know, the highest that they reach to, that's where their kids get to start off, you know. And as a parent, I think about often how you're building everything up and you're building this foundation or whatever, but the highest that you can reach, that's where your kids get to start off. And so everything that I've been able to accomplish has been on the back of what my parents did, and that was on the back of what their parents did. And I know that some people have parents who do more and some people have parents who do less, and it's not about that. It's about what you do with what you were given, and then what you do with that for the generation that comes after you. If you think about who went before you and what they had and the skills that they had, you might be more compassionate when you realize what they did. And if you think about who's coming after you, when you think about who's coming after you, you really get to experience like this pressure of time and knowing like the finiteness of this material existence. And so it then inspires you to perform. At least it has for me. I was 19 when I found out that I was going to be a father, and I think that it was the most incredible pressure to perform, because now it was not just my life that I was messing around with, it was my life and my wife's life, and now this gift from God that I was given, and it's His whole life. I'm responsible for making sure that His floor is as high as it can possibly go. So talk about pressure to perform. And so I just think of the analogy of my grandparents' attic. It's just so beautiful, because my grandma lived in this house, stewarded this house for 20 years, the last 20 years of her life. And this is where she called home and where she made home to so many other people. And then my parents, of course, being the philanthropic missionary people that they are, and not wanting to have roots in Dallas and not feeling like it was where the Lord called them to, they felt like they were supposed to get rid of it. And of course they wanted to keep it in the family, and so they presented the opportunity to all my siblings after my grandma's passing. What are we going to do with the house? And my mom and I came up with the idea of me purchasing the house from them. And so I think my grandma would be a little upset if she knew that I took out a loan to buy the house, but I needed to, I didn't have the money right up front to do it. And so then it worked out really well, and I had a friend who helped me write contracts, and my wife and I were able to purchase this house and then to continue the legacy that my grandma started. And so over the next several months and definitely years, you'll see this attic develop, and you'll see this space really come alive. You'll see of course, insulation and safety things happen, and the wire will be up to code, and lighting and soundproofing, because I'm sure you've heard some cars going by, unless Patrick is a wizard in the post-production. But yeah, I mean, there's just a lot that that I have in plans for this house, and it's very, very, very meaningful to me that I'm in the attic of my great-grandparents' house. This house has been in my family for almost 90 years. I mean, that's substantial to anyone. I mean, and so I'm excited because my children are being raised in this house. I have a 4.5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old who are growing up, and this is their childhood home. And how incredible is that? And maybe this will be their children's childhood home. And so for me, it's just like there's so much pressure to perform. So within this attic, this is where stories will be told. The walls will be built on the foundation that my great-grandparents started to put into place, and that through over the years, my grandmother and my mother and myself have continued to refine. And alongside with God, the more things that you bring into the light and the more things that you purify and the more things that you get to experience the fullness of, then the more that you get to walk and to bask in the glory of what God has created. And then you get to experience, and then you get to shine, and you get to help lead others into experiencing this kind of full gospel. So this attic, to me, it means so much, and I want to share this journey with you guys, because when I look around at this attic and I see just the amount of work that it needs to be done, and just the holes that need to be filled, and the insulation, and all of the things that need to happen in order to make this a suitable living space, or working space rather, I think it's representative of me and of humanity, of all of us, of how we are so broken but we're making do, or how we're so not up to the perfect standard, but we're making do with it. And I think that it's just really, there's something really beautiful about the process of finishing off an attic, and there's something beautiful of the process of, allowing the purification to happen inside of you, and allowing things to be brought into the light, allowing things to lose their stronghold over you. Just like this attic, we all need to be restored. We all need to have some intentional plans and some internal seeking of what are the actual issues that we're experiencing. What is the root of these issues? If something starts breaking in my kitchen downstairs, maybe it's because of some miswiring that I have up here in the attic, or we're plugging up appliances and the breaker flips, and it's like, well, us as humans, it's like, well, if someone cuts you off in traffic and you start screaming and cussing and stuff like that, maybe that's indicative to the fact that there's some sort of internal turmoil that needs to be addressed. Maybe your emotions aren't meant to control you. Maybe your emotions aren't meant to fuel every decision that you make, and you're not supposed to be so reactive to everything that's going on around you. Maybe there's a check engine light on inside of your body, and you just don't know how to read the manual yet. And I experienced that with me and myself, and I found all these anxieties and all these addictions and all these self-soothing coping mechanisms and all of this stuff, trying to solve this issue that I had inside of me, and none of it did, and all of it continued to make it worse. And it wasn't until I took some time to genuinely address my internal self and my spirit man, and to take that before the Lord and to say, I have no idea what to do what you do and fix this. Then the process began, and then I've been able to see it. I've been able to see it in myself, in my personal life, in my marriage, in my relationship with my kids, and with my relationship, with my parents and my siblings, and all the spheres of my life, and my employer and my coworkers and everything. I've begun to see an amazing amount of restoration. And I haven't always walked very closely with God. Like I grew up in a Christian home, and I don't think that I really developed a deep personal sense of my relationship with God until just a couple of years ago. And my importance to Him and His importance to me, I think, were things that I had just kind of I had heard about and maybe I had understood in my head, but I definitely didn't know in my heart. And so the last couple of years, God has really begun to show me how important I am to Him. But of course, through that, it's showed me how important He is to me. And so it's just a long process. And I've seen the process of restoration in my life, the process of purification and relationships come back and all of this stuff. And I know that God will continue to do more. And I'm excited to get to document the things that God does. I'm excited to have a space, a dangerously safe space, where we can talk about these things. We can talk about what it looks like when it feels like God doesn't answer your prayer, and then how later on you might realize that He did, and just in a completely different way, or what it looks like when you feel like you're not hearing from God, or you don't know, or what it looks like when you know that you don't believe what your parents believe, but you still believe something, but you don't feel like you're at home, or what it looks like, when you feel like you can't go to church because some bad things happen to you, and you feel like there's not a space for you there, or you're not ready for it. You're not ready to revisit the judgment or the pain or the hurts or the things that happened to you. And so you just don't go, or you put it off. But then that check engine light comes on and the anxiety comes up, or the turmoil, the internal turmoil begins, or you just begin to realize you're lacking something. And if you don't put God in that spot, you will always move from one thing to the other, continuing to feel this lack. And so my goal with this podcast in this attic is to allow God to continue to do the restoration work in me, in my personal life, and in my family, because I do not believe that anyone ever arrives. I don't think that you get there and all of a sudden everything is peaches and rainbows and sunshine and kisses, and I don't think it gets there. I think that we are constantly a work in process. Maybe it does, and glory to God if it does. But from what I've seen, the people that I know who have walked the longest amount of time with these deep personal walks with God, it's a work in progress, man. And there's always something. There's always more pruning. There's always more purification. There's always more refining. And it's a beautiful process. And you actually fall in love with the pain of the pruning and the purification and that process. And so it becomes something that's really just really sweet. And so my goal is to be able to share that with you guys, to share the process of what God is doing in my life, to steward the resources that the Lord has given me, which I believe He's given me a good ability to communicate and to ask questions and to be the student. And so I have some really cool friends who are going to come on this podcast over the next couple of months, who are I have business friends, philanthropic friends. I have, friends who are just working regular jobs. I have friends who are bartenders, who have been career bartenders, bartending their whole life. I'm a bartender myself. So I have friends who are in the service industry, in management, doing their own thing, independent contractors, all of this stuff. I have artist friends. I have a lot of people who are really close to me, who have allowed this restoration process in their life, and they get to talk about it, and it's beautiful. And no two cases look anything close to being the same, yet there's so much similarities throughout it all. And so I want to invite you guys, because just as this attic is going to be a ridiculous restoration process, and it's going to be piece by piece, and it's going to be slow, and it's going to be daunting, and sometimes it's going to seem like you don't want to do it. That's exactly how it is with your personal development. That's how it was with my development, and that's how it was with anybody who's successful, anybody who's walking closely with the Lord, anybody who has a successful business will tell you that there are things that have to be pruned out of you in order for you to succeed. There are things that you do right now that are holding you back, and the whole saying, you are your own worst enemy, or whatever. And it's like, if you get in the way of that process and you don't allow the flow to happen, then ultimately you get held back by your own self. And so I'm just excited to bring you guys along in this process. I'm excited to share this process with you, and I'm excited to hopefully get to shed some light on areas of y'all's life where maybe you are more empowered than you think to make the change. Maybe you are more empowered than you think to allow God to come in and to help you examine and to identify the areas of your life and the aspects of your life where you need to abide in Him more, and allow Him to abide more in you, and allow Him to slowly and gracefully prune these things out of your life. So join me here in the attic, where God will use us to restore the brokenhearted.